right, everybody. Hello and welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I am ready to go if you are. This week we're talking about the suburbs, a subject near and dear to my heart for a number of different reasons. But my guest today has a very specific and I think devastating take on the American suburbs. His book is called Neighborhood of Fear: The Suburban Crisis in American Culture, 1975 to 2001. And his name is Kyle Riismandel. Kyle tells us all about this book in this conversation. We ended up, really reminiscing about fear, and fear as the organizing principle of our childhood, of our respective childhoods, whether it be fear of Ouija boards or kidnappers or drug dealers or terrorists, or any number of insane, scary things that might happen to you at the mall. The suburbs are kind of an engine of fear. And Kyle's book has a thesis that is really compelling, and this was a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it. We've got lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there, including my new video lecture series on the Vietnam War called Nam TV. We're putting up episode 2 of that this week. Please check that out if you're interested. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I really appreciate the response and all your comments and questions and ideas. And I really appreciate the Patreon community supporting the show. So you can again do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I do appreciate it. And please enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Kyle Riismandel. Okay, Kyle, well, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. When I read the title of your book, I think I was DMing you on Twitter to come talk about it with me on the show before I was even done reading the title of it. And I want to read the title of your book before we even start. It's called Neighborhood of Fear: The Suburban Crisis in American Culture, 1975 to 2001. Thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
The suburbs are such a broad topic, and I wonder what drew you to talking about the suburbs. Because for me, when I hear Neighborhood of Fear, I just think of and those that time period in particular, the late 70s and 80s. That's my childhood, and that is very much the fear I experienced as a kid. But what drew you to this topic in particular?
So I suspect we're probably around the same age. You have far less male pattern baldness, but it really is a story about, I guess at some level my lifetime and my childhood, or it comes out of those experiences from growing up in a place where, you're there for the reasons people went to the suburbs, in 1956, right? Like your parents moved there. They want good schools. They want to own a home, upward mobility, college education, all those things, right? But by those, like the period we're growing up, late 70s, early 80s, I can recall like just the fundamental shift, particularly around kidnapping, as like the first experience of real fear, right? Real fear outside of your family, outside of, the kind of normal things you might be afraid of, being grounded or something. And that continued throughout, this period of time up until sort of 9/11, when I would sort of argue things shift in some way. It's still a neighborhood of fear, but in different ways. Keep forgetting I have wired headphones. So it is really about like why all these people who were white and privileged and largely educated were afraid all the time. It sort of began there. And then, so when I went to graduate school, it was sort of where I started.
Yeah. The kidnapping thing was especially potent for me. I mean, I just remember there's such a deep irony to all of it, because it's like, the suburbs in a lot of ways, that sitcom suburb you're describing, those like 1950s suburbs, that sort of are the suburbs of the American imagination in the late 20th century. Those were places that were designed for families and children, and they were designed around ideas of like these are safe places away from the horrors of the city. And if that's true, then why did I grow up in absolute terror? Particularly of like, I want to get into all the different fears that you catalog here, and because I think they connect so dramatically to the landscape of politics that we're living in right now. You talk about like the Ring app and Nextdoor app, and like that's the our digitized like neighborhood watch sort of thing. But yeah, man, I grew up very scared in the suburbs, which is a deep irony.
No, 100%. And I think one of the things about this is, I like the way you put it, which is the imagination of the 1950s and 60s. And that generation of suburbanites is one of all of these things, right? Sort of largely produced through popular culture, news media, real estate, et cetera, right? As sort of a white, safe experience that is founded on racial difference and class difference, ultimately, right? As white working class people became middle class. But it was, to be fair to that moment, it was also anomalous, right? Like this is completely unlike any other formation in history, particularly American history. And there were lots of people who were scared in those suburbs. They were just not the people you saw on TV, right? So Stephanie Kuntz's book, The Way We Never Were, is really good about sort of unpacking the politics of this memory, right? Like why it's such a cudgel of the 1980s and 90s to beat over the heads of feminists or gay rights or whatever, to say, we want to go back to this mythic time. And she's like, well, that mythic time was actually rampant domestic violence, right? Women were trapped in homes with violent people, teenage pregnancy and illegal abortions, all of these things that were kind of invisible, largely speaking, because of this other image, right? And so we use that image as sort of like a reference point. And I think you're right. The book is in the same way, right? So I'm sort of marking a new era where the fear becomes apparent, and it's apparent because it's happening to the people who thought they were safe, right? The people who weren't necessarily feeling trapped or hurt or marginalized in that earlier period.
Where do the fears come from? Because the kidnapping thing. I mean, all I think about is the fact that I was very, very young in having the knowledge that Adam Walsh, the son of John Walsh on America's Most Wanted. I knew that story when I was really young, and I knew the story that the kid was decapitated. Like it was like a horror story. It was presented as a horror story. Not only that, but it was because he walked away from his mom to go play a video game at the mall. It's such a suburban like horror nightmare. And that part of it, but also drugs. I mean, like the DARE program at school was a delivery system for fear as well. The idea that there were like drug dealers that were going to pass me candy of some kind. You've tapped into something that for me like goes off into because it goes into mass incarceration and prisons. I mean, there's so much. But in terms of the kidnapping thing, where does that fear come from? Why it's got to be more than Adam Walsh.
So, I think one of the bigger picture things of the book is trying to understand how and why things become legible as dangerous, right? That,
right.
It is, part of the job of history to sort of understand why things that are now sort of obvious to us or apparent at the time or logical at the time made sense, right? So I think it's a couple of things. One, it is the politics of law and order, and I think ultimately like the sort of carceral state that you're talking about. Paul Renfro's new book, Stranger Danger, is essentially about this, right? So it makes sort of visible, and it makes people feel that crime is everywhere, that there is a sense of criminality is somehow inherent to the culture. And this is coming out of, the urban crisis of the 1960s and the rebellions, and then the massive backlash through law and order politics. So suburbanites are not immune to that politics, even though crime is sort of seen elsewhere. But they have this sense of, the rising tide of crime that politicians continue to capitalize on through, up until very recently, I would say, the 1994 crime bill being a prime example. But so one is crime is sort of more visible, legible, and in the culture, sort of you're able to see yourself as possibly being victimized. And the way in which Adam Walsh emerges as this kind of necessary materiality of the threat, that it's not, so the white van is sort of like this kind of urban legend or cultural myth, but it's meaningful and scary because there's a real kid who this happened to, that everyone can accept as a reality. And from that moment, right, he's used as a symbol. He's used as a symbol of this kidnapping epidemic, which is now spreading through news media and popular culture at this massive rate. So by 1985, 86, the news media is saying, we have 50,000 kids every year who are taken from their families, right? Like this is a massive number of people. Of course, it's not true.
I was going to say, is that real?
No, not remotely, right? And so, but there's a couple of dynamics there, right? One is it sells newspapers. It connects to this larger culture of focus on the family and the idea of sort of the decline of the nuclear family, and so that children are in threat in all these ways, including being left alone at home, including having single parents, including going to public spaces by themselves where they could be picked up, right? So it taps into a bunch of those things again that make this fear seem more real and more sort of prevalent. But no, the number is like 80, right? Like if I recall correctly. And stranger abductions are extremely rare. So abductions are almost always part of custody or family disputes. They're almost never just, and if they are part of this other sort of narrative, they are, I hate to give this credit to QAnon, but at some level they are part of like this broader culture of sort of trafficking, rather than sort of the Adam Walsh style story.
Which was sort of always couched in this again, imagination reality of like a serial killer, like a lone monster, like some drooling psychopath in a members only jacket that's gonna stuff you in a van. That was a real fear for me for sure, and not only that, but a fear that adults talked about like around me.
This is the thing about it, right? Is that it gets promoted and in some sense enhanced through popular culture, through news media, and to some degree through folk, what we would normally call folklore, right? The kind of way in which people communicate analog, about these things in neighborhoods, right? And they create the apparatus of fear, right? So part of the dynamic of the book is that the responses to fear promote the fear itself, that the neighborhood watch is the constant reminder that there's someone in your neighborhood who wants to break into your house, rape your wife, or steal your child, right? Arming of an alarm system is a reminder that you live in your own jail. So, and this is amongst many other things I talk about in the book, but that security culture in particular always is promoting the threat, the idea of crime being prevalent within this broader culture of law and order, right? So they could easily tap into the broader things around the national political conversation about crime.
Yeah, it connects to. I'm hearing about the Republican Party and building that sort of like suburban base is partly shaped around this idea. It seems like gun rights and the Second Amendment becoming like a major Republican Party issue is in part this based on this idea that. God, to me, it's a fantasy that like there are goons that are coming to your house and you're going to have to shoot it out with them. I mean, that's generally what people that have guns in their homes would say. That's why they have them, right? I mean, it's sort of like, and the idea that threat is imagined or largely imagined is pretty incredible. I mean, it's almost, I can see a through line in all of American history, actually. They kind of like invent the threat and then arm up against it.
Yeah, I mean, this is not new in terms of like a political organizing tactic, but what you're getting at is the sort of dialectic between sort of the lived experience of these voters or citizens and the larger political sort of framework, right? Like that larger political framework is enabling this way of seeing the world, that you've bought this house, you have these property rights, and you must protect them. And if the state will not help you, then you will do it yourself. And so you will create this neighborhood watch, you'll own a gun, you'll do all of these things, and ultimately, hire your own security, right? That you will have a security that works for you, that's an adjunct of the state, right? And of course, this is always posed in high relief to urban people of color, right? That they are almost always policed strictly by the state, right? They don't have this kind of access or privilege in space. And so this privatization of space is made possible by this law and order sort of dynamic at the sort of big picture national level, but also all the things you're talking about, right? The ways in which crime feels local and pervasive allows for this, even when, virtually any other kind of, I don't want to say objective because crime stats are extremely political, but they show basically that violent crime has gone down continuously for 30 years, right? That that the sense of real constant crime is just not there, or the actual occurrences really are not there.
On the spatial part of it that you're talking, the construction of the suburbs, the mall and the neighborhoods, how does that correlate to this idea of fear? Because I find that a very compelling idea, that there's sort of a relationship to the construction of and layout of the suburbs and this production of fear, even if it's an imagined one.
Yeah, it sort of boils down to sort of this idea of producing space, right? That space is socially constructed at some level. And that means that it's not inherently anything other than what people make it, right? Through their use, through imagining it, through how they regulate and police it. So this emergence of different kinds of threats, right? So to your earlier example, right? The kidnapper is in some sense dangerous because he is a white person who can blend into suburban society, right? He is not this kind of marked non-white person who is still clearly scary and clearly regulated, right? But it's a different kind of threat. It's more subversive. And so therefore requires all these new techniques to regulate space. And similarly, right, the teenager emerges as dangerous in the 1970s in suburbs, right? So you have the earlier period of the 1950s kind of hoodlum, derelict, et cetera, right, in urban spaces. And now there's this like teenage iteration, that gets played out in popular culture again, sort of most manifestly. And so those people are also dangerous because they're from this place, right? They are products of the suburbs. They live there and belong there. And yet they are what's dangerous to that space. And so the production of those spaces is always embattled, always about control, and at some level, always about sort of disciplinary action by private interests, right? With the help of corporations and the state. It's just constantly reiterated in all the ways in which the spaces actually function through their regulation, whether it's security, whether it's cameras, whether it's like sort of ordinances and other things that businesses push for. It's always this sort of, as you put it, it's always spatial, right? This is why this is a book about the suburbs and not necessarily about like some other kind of cultural formation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the mall specifically because, and skateboarding too, because everywhere when I was growing up, I saw bumper stickers that said, and they weren't on car bumpers usually. They were on like kids' binders at school that said skateboarding is not a crime, right?
Yeah,
and it was in response to the idea that like the city council in my town was passing ordinances about skateboarding that seemed to be aimed directly at what you're talking about here. This like sort of hysteria and concern about the threat is coming from inside the house now, right? Like the teenagers are punks, they're acting out. And that in the 80s, man, that was in my town, there was a deep concern about that. There were kids wearing makeup, goth kids. Like, I mean, there were articles in our local newspaper about high school students dressed up basically like Robert Smith from The Cure, like
goth culture,
right,
goth culture.
There you go. Can you talk a little bit about that, because it seems like
Sure.
the cultural element and the like fear of what was happening to the kids was such a like cycle. Like it's happened in the 50s, it happened in the 60s, but it had a very particular flavor in the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, we always kind of want to root ourselves in a time and place, right? That like, the invention of the teenager itself is relatively recent. So that's probably why it starts in the 50s, at least as this kind of a particular consumer or citizen, in quotes. Yeah. But you're right. Like this fear of the teen in the suburbs is really about space, right? That they are outside of a place, the school or the home, where they can be disciplined and regulated. And that their behavior in those spaces is in some way indicative of the broader failure of the nuclear family. So this is a bipartisan consensus that happens in the late 70s, that everyone's basically saying, oh my God, this thing we thought was the sort of marker of American success, the thing that protects us in the Cold War, produces citizens, has actually failed or is failing. And so we need to restore these values, look back to the 50s. And again, this is like Democrats and Republicans. This is not necessarily only a talking point for sort of the religious right. Now, they may talk about it in some different ways, right? But ultimately, there's a kind of consensus. The way I use it in the book is talking about the documentary The Decline of Western Civilization, because that phrase really is about this idea for people who are concerned about the family. And so this concern about the family plays out through these teenagers who are not conforming, right? They're not conforming in their sort of gender performance. They're not conforming in their sexuality. And they're not conforming even in their sort of consumptive practices, right? That they go to the mall, but they don't buy anything. They cause trouble. They shoplift. They disrupt other shoppers. This is problematic for people who own the mall, even though they need teenagers at some level to exist. And so you get the mall rat and all these other things. So they're regulated because they're sort of symbolic of this broader failure that the national politics seems to agree is happening.
Well, yeah, the mall rat. Like, what is the mall rat? It seems like it's something we'll have to explain to people.
Really? Oh, wow. Okay.
Later. No, I don't mean on the show. I mean like in the future. Like we'll have to say, what's a mall rat? Because in a lot of ways, it feels like the mall rat. I mean, my mall in the two giant malls in my little suburban area are empty and have been empty, and it was something that was happening pre-COVID. Like the kids are hanging out somewhere else now. It seems like the mall rat is almost like a brief moment in time as a sort of subject.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is the result of the stuff I talk about in the book, right? The erasure at some level of teens from public space in this very particular way. Is intentional, right? It's done on purpose. So part of the narrative of the book is they're reintegrated into the home, and that becomes its own site of danger through popular culture and the occult. But that in public space, right, they're basically gone, or they're really tightly regulated in ways that make it not fun to be there if you're a teenager, right? So the arcade basically dies out as a standalone thing, and the shopping mall, both because of competition from online eventually, but because of these practices, is just simply not cool. And the kids, I think, probably 10 to 15 years younger than us, are of that generation that are highly scheduled, right? That like their lives are more structured in these suburban towns, and I think probably ours was. Right. So, whether it's, kind of professionalized practice for sports, right? So you can't just be on the baseball team, but you need to go to the batting cage and have a hitting coach, and you need to stretch and work out, and you need to have muscle, just like this like massive amount of like scheduling and practice and things that like simply really didn't exist for most kids who would otherwise be on the basketball court, at the playground, at the mall, at the arcade. Right. And so the spaces sort of shrink for a variety of reasons, but part of it is this intense regulation of teens and fear about teens. And you're talking about goth culture. I deal with the Columbine and Marilyn Manson. There's such a hilarious is maybe the wrong word, but when you rewatch the footage and the coverage and you read all that stuff from that period of time, that summer, it is amazing how many times the word goth is said, and it's used in this pejorative sense as sort of really connecting back to the satanic panic, that it like kind of is symbolizing this emergence of a dark, anti-Christian culture. And that's why these kids are doing this, right? Not just these two guys, but teens. I had this one quote from a mom who's just like, she hosts a goth dance club in her garage, right? And she's just like, oh, these goths, they're just so nice. She's just like, she can't wrap her head around why people are so afraid. They're like, they just like makeup, or boots. It was just like so, like Midwestern and down home. And yet the whole discourse is these are the kids who are undermining American society.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right. I mean, the goth thing was huge, and it makes me think of the West Memphis 3. If you remember that case, and how those kids went to death row more or less over a satanic panic. And that makes me think about the line between, like you mentioned, QAnon. Like it seems like your book is tracking. I mean, to me, like QAnon emerges from the suburbs. Like QAnon is a suburban middle class phenomenon. It fits directly into the sort of things you're describing. Particularly, I mean, the stuff about fear about the kids, both like that the kids are going to be victims, but also the kids are maybe like the bad ones too.
Or they can be, right? That because they're like these liminal figures that can go either way. It's extremely important that they be taught correctly, right? They're educated morally in all these ways. It's why battles over schools are so potent, right? That like, well, if they learn this version of America where slavery was bad and the Civil War was bad, right? Like, then they will somehow internalize that America is bad, and that will make them bad people, right? Like, there is this real sort of cultural logic that continues, and it's like Adam Walsh, right? You need one real example from which all this can spring, right? To be able to point to the materiality of the threat allows you to make all of these claims. So I say in the book, right, it's about privatizing police or, sort of regulating space through NIMBYism. But I think for QAnon, like Jeffrey Epstein was a gift, right? They say, see, here's this guy trafficking in young women, right? For, famous people. Now, they would probably say liberals, but it's clearly just famous people, celebrities and politicians, for their pleasure, right? These are basically people in sex slavery. And so that alone now justifies all of these other beliefs, all these other practices, and they've been primed to think this way, right? I guess part of my point here is this is, as Richard Hofstadter says, the paranoid style, right? Like it builds from this thing to see the world in this way as being machinations you can't quite see, but are there. And this one example proves to you that it exists.
What were the one examples of occult and satanic stuff, or what were the things that people were pointing to in the 80s to say, like, look, this is real? Because I mean, I remember certain, like, there were like heavy metal suicides and like some like cases that led to this. I feel like they led to like pushes for like censorship and parental advisory stickers and that sort of stuff. But what were people freaking out about Satan for in the 80s?
So, I mean,
I know that's like a weird way of putting it, but that's what they were doing, right?
It's actually not a weird. It's exactly the way of putting it. I always think of in We Didn't Start the Fire, that comes out in 1989, and Billy Joel, says heavy metal suicide is part of the story of post-war America, right? When he lists all these events or post-war globe, and it always makes me laugh. So I'm like, wow, that is like how prevalent that fear was, that he had to name check it, right? That he had to think about,
heavy metal
alongside
suicide,
right, like alongside JFK or Watergate. It feels But I think it gets to your point, right? Like that it became so in the air of the culture that you couldn't ignore it. So it comes out of a bunch of things, right? Again, so the 70s are this transitional point for a lot of these things because the outcome of the sexual revolution and to some degree the sort of search for spirituality outside of organized religion that happens. So you see all these it's why all these cult documentaries start in the 70s, right? And so there is like a visible non-Christian or non-Judeo-Christian religious movement happening or spiritual movement happening. And many people attribute it to, in particular, the religious right, the rise of the religious right, or the re-rise, I should say, of the religious right as a political organization frames it as the work of Satan. And this is being beamed into homes through televangelists, mostly in the suburbs. And so they see, right, whatever it might be. So Charles Manson writes, or maybe more obviously in the earlier period of, satanic, or at least, says he's satanic, or David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, or whatever. But they see these movements and that they're gaining followers as something that is anti-Christian and therefore must be satanic. And so anything that happens after that, right, that even has smacks of the occult is going to be called satanic. So you get, like you said, the heavy metal suicides were real. Teen suicide was a real problem of the 1980s. And one of the argument I make in the book is the focus on culture actually hurts teens, right? It actually says to them, or it's, creates this sort of structure that says, we can't help you. All we can do is take away your posters and your records and your leather jacket, right? You can't play Dungeons and Dragons. You can't go to this concert, but we can't actually help you with the thing that makes you feel suicidal, right? Which are, as we now know, right, a disease. It's treatable in all these ways. But we basically ignored these structural solutions for these cultural ones, and they are productive. They're productive for parents, right, who want to take over, kind of exert control. They're productive for politicians who are trying to reify this idea of the nostalgic traditional family, right? It does all this work, except for the thing it's trying to actually do. And it's part of that bigger turn, right? We're sort of saying government doesn't work. Well, here's the proof, right? It kind of undermining it from within.
And it's really confusing for kids too, because for me, I grew up with the onslaught of American pop culture and enjoying American pop culture. But then I had different parents in the neighborhood or when I went to youth group that were warning me about various elements of pop culture that I enjoyed. I particularly remember a suburban mom telling me that I shouldn't play with He-Man toys because they were like black magic and all this. But that same mom, and this is really sort of the connection I would make. It's sort of like the QAnon and things like that. And ask you like sort of what are the wider real hysterias these are reflecting? Because I remember that family when we would drive around a lot and, they would take us to soccer games and stuff like that, soccer practice. We would pass this temple, this sort of like religious building, and I wasn't sure what it was. They always told me that they worship Satan in there. That's the devil in there. And as I got older, I realized that it's a mosque. And I think one of the only mosques in the whole sort of region. And to me, that's just extraordinary because now I'm like, well, here's like, here's the Islamophobia, and here's that connection you're making where there's like sort of something happens with 9/11. Something happens where these fears get like translated into something else. And it's big. It's like nationalism and imperialism.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the argument I'm making is like by the time 9/11 happens, people are ready to be afraid and they're ready to leverage their fear into power. Right. And so when it's now terrorism, rather than maybe the satanic panic or some of these other things like kidnapping have fallen away, they're now ready to be angry about Middle Eastern people in their community, right? The diversity that might be sort of happening in suburban America. People are building bunkers and buying guns and plastic sheeting, right? All that stuff is happening because people were ready, right? It didn't just overnight, they didn't decide suddenly we're afraid, but they were prepared to be afraid in these ways. And it gives them power, right? It recenters them and their culture. So to your point of your neighbor, right? The point of not even trying to understand Islam or the mosque, right, is simply to say that it's not us. It's not this community. It's not my religion. It's not my culture or values. And so that's sort of Satanism as a brand. And this is why the Satanists on Twitter are so funny. So they're like, that's actually not what Satanism is. They're like really hilariously it's like progressive, I guess. But always
they have great barbecues.
yeah. They're just like, that's not Satanism. That's not Satanism. You just call it, you don't like it, but it's not Satanism. And I think that's what happens is people like that are just, it's a way to recenter your own values and to take some, what they would, I think, view as power back in their community or their visibility in the community.
how much of this stuff? It's such an interesting interplay because it seems like it's both. It's being reflected in the culture, but the media is really producing this in some way as well. And I don't just mean the news, although the news, like, to me, was just horror growing up with all this stuff. But even like, I mean, every sitcom had a kidnap plot, right? Like, I'm thinking of Different Strokes, but there were others, I think too, that like did this thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is when we think about culture, we always think about it in those two ways, right? It's both reflecting sort of some narrative or cultural ideal, even if it's sort of sublimated, and it's producing it, right? It's pushing it forward as legitimate, real, and pervasive. So that's why we look at popular culture, news media to understand these things, is because as they remain prevalent as narratives or images, we know it remains as a framework, a way of making sense of the world. So, I talk about this Family Ties episode in the book where the Keatons buy a gun, right? Like, and
wow, I didn't know this episode.
Right. Because
tell me about this episode.
And remember, like, the book in some ways, or the show dramatizes what I'm talking about in the book so well, just as a big picture thing, because the family, right, the parents are hippies who settled down in the suburbs, and their son is this, neoconservative Reaganite, right? Like, who like is like apologizing for Nixon and all these things. And so that's the dynamic of the show. And they end up getting a gun because their house has been broken into. They create a neighborhood watch. They go to join the neighborhood watch, and the cop tells them, "This won't help you." Right? He says, like, if you're they're gonna get you. So don't be, don't worry about it.
Wow.
And so he basically says, "Get a gun," and they get a gun. And Stephen King comes down one night when Michael J. Fox comes home late, and he almost shoots him, right? And he says, "We're not gun people," so he puts it away. But like, the searing image is like, you're going to be victimized and guns are dangerous, but yet we should still be afraid of people breaking into your house, right? Like, it shows part of what I'm, the political allegiances or ideological allegiances are very flexible, that these are people who vote. In some sense, their ideology is self-interest, right? They are not necessarily wedded to, say, environmentalism. They care if their water is clean, but they don't care about the environmental movement, right? And they may not necessarily care about the religious right, but it allows them, right, to police their kids in these ways. So if you don't have to tune into Jerry Falwell to understand all this, but Jerry Falwell helps you, right, take down these heavy metal posters that freak you out. It gives you like a legitimacy to, like, de-metal, as they called it, your son's bedroom.
How much is the war on drugs a part of this too? Because it seems like you talk about the real stuff, that like there'd be one real story, and that would become the sort of, in my town, there was a kid who lived in my neighborhood who at the age of 21 overdosed on heroin. And was someone who was like a high school star, like that had actually a plaque at the school because he was the only person to get a 1600 on the SAT.
Wow.
And he was like this clean cut American boy, but he went down, started wearing a black trench coat, getting into goth stuff, and he became a heroin addict and really died at 21. And that story was the warning from my parents about getting into goth or getting into metal music, or in other words, the connection was drugs. It was like, if you get into like some sort of like freaky music of any kind, even if it's like Sublime, and yeah, well, to be fair, the guy from Sublime died of a heroin overdose, but stuff like that. I mean, it was just any kind of counterculture was the path to drugs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we don't use that word a lot in this era, but you're right. It is because it has countered this sort of mainstream white Christian culture. It is branded as dangerous and therefore deadly, right? So you're right about the drug war. You were talking about DARE earlier.
Yeah.
One of the ironies of DARE, right, is that most kids learn about what drugs are what and how to use them through DARE. They'd never seen drugs before, weren't around drugs, but then a cop came and said, this is Molly, this is meth, this is crack. Here's where you get it. Here's how you smoke it. And we're like, this sounds like a lot of fucking fun. Like, what are we doing? Right. And so a lot of suburban kids actually are exposed to drugs through the DARE program, which is,
unsurprising. The first time I heard acid stories and trip reports, it was literally from a cop telling us about these things. I was like, I've never heard. I mean, it was 5th grade. I was 9 years old. I think about like a 9-year-old now, and I'm like telling them about acid and ecstasy. I'm like, how do you even grasp what that is?
Oh yeah. I mean, the scared straight ideal is prevalent in this moment. In some ways, like maybe the biggest failure of the book, or the thing that is the least in there, is this context around the war on drugs and things like there. I don't know if you know the historian Matt Lasseter, but he wrote the book about busing in Charlotte, which now I can't remember.
That's how it happens on the podcast. You always I feel the terrible. Mind is blank when there are names. Yeah,
he's the nicest guy in the world too, and he's very smart. But he's currently working on a book that covers sort of the same period as mine about the suburbs, and he's published something already about sort of this exact thing about sort of carceral state, war on drugs in the suburbs. And part of what you're getting at here, I think, or part of what's I think an answer to this question is the disparate outcomes between urban and suburban America, right? Like we know what happens between 1970 and today with populations of color and in urban places, and it's the flip side in the suburbs, right? Like, so your friend or the person you went to school with, dies and becomes like this symbol, almost like a martyr for the cause of preventing drug abuse. But there's not a massive crackdown of militarization of police in your suburban town, right? Like it doesn't work the same way. It's this cultural construct that says get scared straight. It's a failure of morality and choice. It has nothing to do with what we now know, which is addiction as a disease, right? It puts this frame, which frankly is the facilitation of the opioid epidemic, that framing it as a moral failing and not seeing it as a multiracial problem meant that tons and tons of people died from these drugs because they were not seen as addicts or as treatable. Including these massive amount of what are relatively poor white people. And quite clearly in urban America, those populations were treated as essentially criminals. So they received no treatment or any kind of give in the system. Right. So the white kid who's arrested, who's 19 and dealing pot or cocaine, right, slap on the wrist, we'll send you to boarding school or whatever, right? Military school or college, and that'll right the ship, whereas Black and Hispanic boys who are 14 are treated as adults. It's just Victor Rios's book Punished is really excellent about, if people are interested about that dynamic.
And I think it's the Matt Lasseter book called The Silent Majority.
Thank you. I was like, it's a famous phrase. I'm like, there's White Flight and Silent Majority. And those are the two books. So thank you.
Matt Lasseter, The Silent Majority, Suburban Politics in the Sun Belt South. That looks great too.
Yeah. No, it's one of the foundational books of the new suburban history of he's probably a half generation older than me. So I came after him and I read books like that. I was like, oh wow, these people are really taking apart this whole other history now. It's really good. And I'm sure his new book will be amazing.
That's really interesting that that the connection between the counterculture and the hysteria of the counterculture as a pathway to drugs. It's such a different understanding of what we think about when we think about the opiate problem in America in the 21st century. We don't just say, well, opiates are happening because there's counterculture in America. No one says that. No one makes that argument. And yet in the 80s, it was people who there was this kind of similar figure as the kidnapper was the drug dealer. The drug pusher, that was just going to hand you the drug and get you addicted. In other words, there was no sense that I would organically want to do drugs. Yeah, right. The drugs could be for fun or are enjoyable in any way. Right. Or that there would be some issue with me that I would want to, self-medicate. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of the thing I'm getting at with suicide as well, is that the look to Satan, the look to heavy metal, the look to goth, or the scared straight of dare is all really trying to be cultural solutions to sort of systemic problems of healthcare and mental illness, right? That to treat illness as addiction as a disease requires the infrastructure to do so, requires the political will and the money to do so, which we clearly have not had. And this is why we stand in such stark relief to other countries that have addiction issues, but are dealing with them through their sort of state-run healthcare, right? And so by the time the opioid epidemic comes, I think it's treated similarly in that it's not counterculture, but it is about morality. It's about choice and discipline, right? These kind of fundamental capitalist ideas that run through, all of these problems. So it's if you give in, right, you are not disciplined. You're making a poor choice. Or if you get addicted, right, you can't even simply try or do this thing. It's your fault rather than, I think as we now know, that new book that just came out, Empire of Pain, right, that it was a systematic corporate thing by the Purdue Pharma, right, and the Sacklers to sell these drugs to these people who didn't need them, right, and they're by their nature addictive, and millions of people have died, right? These are
up there with like the atomic bomb. We're up there with millions. You know what I mean? Like we're talking.
Yeah,
it was one of the biggest killers.
Yeah, and when I mean, some of those long form investigative pieces, I don't know, in the Times or Atlanta, they're like sort of documented like how doctors became like sort of street level dealers. I mean, it's actually fucking unbelievable how criminal and sinister, and the scale of it is mind-boggling. And so then to think about all that in the context of like suburbs and like the pusher, the individual drug dealer somewhere is just so absurd. And yet that's how I think a lot of people still think of it. I don't think everyone's like knows about the Sackler family and all that. They're still blaming the kind of terrifying other is still the drug dealer. Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's like the person who shows up at the school who's 21 at an elementary school in a trench coat. It's all these same kind of shadowy figures rather than the person in the white coat who's telling you need this thing for your back pain that you actually don't really need. It's not that far off from Mother's Little Helper of the 1950s and 60s, right? That here's this drug to treat this thing that's, a real problem, but doesn't actually treat the disease, right? Like makes you feel better, helps you do your housework and keep your husband pleased, but doesn't actually address your ennui or depression or why you feel this way about being trapped in this home. It's a similar thing here. It's like, yeah, this is real pain people have, but it's not actually addressing the problem. It's just making you feel better. And, sort of marries together the kind of late period capitalist mentality and really, quite frankly, skill, as you put it, to sell things and to sell things in this through legitimate organs, right? Such as medicine or doctors, and like this morality thing where, it's okay in here. We're giving you this kind of permission structure to take this thing over here with modern chemistry, where the thing is so highly addictive that you can't not be addicted. It's really actually difficult if you take them on any kind of regular basis. Like that's why they don't really even give them out now. Like they've really pulled back on surgeries and other things.
Right.
So if they give you 7, you're going to want 14.
Oh yeah, and you hear about like fentanyl, and it's just so fucking deadly.
Oh my god!
And so how does this even exist?
They created a market for a thing they made that then became, basically this highly addictive drug that kills, hundreds of thousands, not millions of people, with virtually no responsibility taken. And they're able to do it because of the stuff we're talking about. This cultural frame for drug use, drug abuse, and legitimate drug use, right? Like through medicine.
Your argument taps into something, and your book taps into this period, between 1975 and 2001. That seems like you can really get your hands around a certain like place and a certain set of phenomenon. The suburbs became an engine of a certain kind of politics, but now it seems like all that stuff spread outside the suburbs, if that makes sense, right? Like it seems like almost. I just taught a class on like the history of the suburban like sort of like landscapes and the different like kinds of like throughout American history, and it's like it's always there's always been an impulse to sort of like live outside the city and that kind and all that sort of stuff. But it seems like this moment in that the post-war moment that you're writing about, there's a politics that develops that's like becomes a mass politics in a way that we never saw before. It seems like the suburban politics took over the GOP in a lot of ways, and maybe the Democrats too.
No, absolutely. I mean, yes, I totally agree, and that is the perhaps not as highlighted as I would like, if I had more time. But I think that is an argument of the book, is that the sort of rightward shift of American politics and culture is driven by the suburbs. It is also addressed to the suburbs, right? So sort of, again, that sort of need, they're enacting these policies day to day of localism, privatism, family values, and to some degree, even environmentalism. At the same time, they're being told they should be doing these things, right? So they make manifest the policies as real and the power they get from it. So as I said, it's sort of a politics of individualism or self-determination that can be, so mobilized through any kind of national discourse, right? So, Bill Clinton saying the era of big government is over is an appeal to that same voter that Reagan is talking to in 1980, where government is the problem, right? They are not that far off in that politics, even if they are seen as perhaps ideologically very different, right, around some of these other issues. And so, yeah, I think you're right. Like I would say politics had been suburbanized, but what that also meant is that politics at some level then is serving their self-interest as much as any ideological end of small government or any of these other things. Because as I show in the book, the state is very helpful to them when they want it, right? When they need it to do stuff. So when they're saying, we don't want a trash compactor or an incinerator, we don't want a clinic or a halfway house, we don't want some place where, inmates are going to be transported in our neighborhood, the government doesn't put it there, right? They need the government to not do that. They're perfectly happy to have it be facilitated there, even if they're voting against, quote unquote, big government or taxes or whatever. So, it's just remembering that dynamic, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
And it's spatial too, right? Like your point about sort of the suburbs are everywhere, I think is true, right? Like what is gentrification if not suburbanization of the city? Or high rise or whatever.
Well, once I lived in New York for many, many years, and at some point in Manhattan, it started to be like Home Depots and Applebee's and an Outback Steakhouse on 23rd Street. And I was thinking, like, I pay a lot to live in this city, and part of the reason people paid a lot to live in New York was because there was such a rich sort of access to culture, and all of a sudden, I'm looking at all the places that are in my hometown, like the same sort of mall corporate yogurt shops are there, and there's something about the character of it that's incredibly. I mean, talk about fear, but it's also like just alienating and depressing. Like that sort of structure and even aesthetic is awful. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't feel good. And the suburbs have gotten, I think, even worse by that count. I mean, now it's just like layers of abandonment on top of that, and like. Here's the I look at the Verizon wireless store, and I'm like, I fondly remember when it used to be a Boston market, and like that,
right.
That's the progression in the town.
Yeah, you walk here like, can I have a SIM card and a rotisserie chicken?
Yep.
I know what you mean. It is extremely alienating. I mean, I'm sure you know the architectural history literature and all this stuff, but it's the reason the city is doing this, right? The sort of fun city or revitalization project, it also begins in this exact same period as a response to crisis, right? And frankly, rather than dealing with the roots of crisis, is to say, we're going to be capitalism, right? We're going to be tourist destination. We're going to have a convention center and a stadium. And what we really want are white people from the suburbs to come here. And so gentrification, or these things you're talking about, are a way to make it safe for those people to consume and frankly, move back if they can afford it. Because the people who can't afford it are the people who are local or sort of live there over a long period of time because of the way in which these sort of economies work. It's really fascinating because even like the experience of Brooklyn or other neighborhoods that are gentrified that are not necessarily corporatized and quite as transparently anyway. They probably are in terms of real estate ownership. Is that they're providing these cultural experiences that are also already sort of cleansed or Disneyfied in some way, the connection to your sort of urban ethnic past or to this particular racial or ethnic group, like a Chinatown or other kinds of things, right? There's lots of studies of those but that is to me in my mind, like what you're saying is like, it's suburbanization of this thing, and it's welcoming or comforting even that alienating landscape to these white consumers from the suburbs, even as it's alienating to the people who live there, right, or are part of these communities.
Right.
I mean, I don't know where you're from. Where are you from? Out of curiosity.
I'm from and live currently in Ventura, California, which is between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, and it's a town that it's one of those cities that, like, when I teach my suburbs class here at a college locally, we argue about whether or not this town is a suburb, because a lot of people are like, no, this developed as an oil depot, after it was a Spanish colonial outpost. It was an oil and railroad depot, and it didn't really become what we call suburban. It's like, well, what do we really mean when we say suburban? And to most people, it means like tract housing, and the mall. Like that's what this suburbia is to people. But it's a really amorphous thing to define, right? And even more so now, I feel like.
I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I definitely feel like it is a cultural construction, right? Like any other space. So, what is the urban or anything else? And so it has to be contextual to have any meaning.
Right.
And so it's hard to say, right? But like, I take your point that what is suburban is not always suburban. It's always in the act of becoming, right? It's always being made as it to be the thing. So, Ventura doesn't sound unlike lots of California suburbs that began as industrial suburbs or outposts, right? That sort of justified the movement of population, the building of residences, the structure of government, and sometimes subsidized it, right? So Robert Self in American Babylon talks a lot about, this version of the industrial garden is we bring GM in, they subsidize our property taxes, they bring us jobs, and yet we still get to live in this kind of quintessential picturesque suburb. And then when the factory closes, we're fucked, right? Like,
right.
And now we have the problems of the 70s and 80s, right? So that sounds very typical in that way. But kind of part of the thing I was reacting against in writing this book and originally working on his dissertation was this real fundamental need to define in some quantitative way what a suburb is. It just felt to me like such a fool's errand. It only served the purposes of the politics of the person writing the book, right? That like, and it's not to say those books aren't useful or don't do useful things, but like measuring like office square footage versus bedroom square footage, or like how many highways or whatever. I mean, I'm sure we can come to, if we want, some 4 or 5 things we would think of as kind of common. But like what it is cultural. What it is about like the way in which these values play out. That's why, you know, I would argue the neighborhood of fear is sort of that kind of construct, right? This is what defines the suburbs over this period, as opposed to what comes before.
Fear
and
is
to some degree what comes after.
I love that. You're like, what are the suburbs? That's easy. The place where you're afraid.
Yeah, and people were afraid before that, right? Like they were afraid of black people and they were afraid of lots of other things, but it wasn't culturally defined, right? The interactions of people weren't mediated through shared fears for the most part.
You know what's interesting? Speaking of, I feel like we're in part a culture of nostalgia around the 80s right now, you know, and I mean, you and I could probably talk for another hour about like Stranger Things, but like it seems like a production like that. I mean, when I think of like basically like a bunch of like white kids on bicycles, like E.T., like that's the image of, to me, that like that was pushed hard in the culture of like what the suburbs were like a bunch of kids on bicycles, boys usually adventuring around. And Stranger Things is doing like kind of a meta thing with all of that, but it seems like it's identifying sort of fear again as a central component of what the suburbs are, for sure.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. I think, you know, as soon as I saw that show, I was like, oh my God, you know, like it is nostalgic for the satanic panic. And it's also saying it's real at some level, right? That there are evil, nefarious forces operating through the occult to undermine this town and its values, right? Like, and to endanger our children. But of course, the kids are the heroes in that Spielbergian sense, right? They are like, have moral clarity and act, you know, all these things. But I will say E.T., you know, E.T. is scary. That is you know, when you watch that movie, right,
horrifying.
It is not that far away from Poltergeist, right? And you know, they're made almost simultaneously. And Spielberg kind of pseudo directs Poltergeist as well, but they kind of tap into that exact same fear just through different genres. But they're at the outsider, the unknown, this fear that we have sort of victimized ourselves at some level by moving here, being in this place. The overwhelming response by law, you know, especially ET, right, of law enforcement to this outsider. You know, there's a lot going on there that embodies this fear. Certainly from the perspective of parents or adults. Anyway, the kids is maybe slightly different because, you know, Carol Ann walks into the TV because it's calling to her. She's like, yeah, this, you know, I like the TV, you know, where the parents are like, no.
The idea of E.T. being a kids movie was kind of absurd to me because I mean, I watched that when I was very, very young, and it was a totally traumatic experience. And you're right, like for me, it was actually the idea that the alien was in the house, you know, and was like that cute sort of scene where the alien is sort of E.T.'s hiding in all the stuffed animals. That was not cute or funny to me as a kid. It was like a physical, visual manifestation of everything I was afraid of. And it's like the sanctity of that house. That house was supposed to be safe.
I mean, exactly. I mean, as just what I was about to say is like, it's both like all the kid fears of things that are scary, like monsters or whatever, but also it's in your house, it's real, and this place that's supposed to be safe is not. You know, if you had to boil it down, that's probably, you know, what the book is about.
This was great. I really enjoyed talking with you, Kyle. I want to say the name of your book again, which is Neighborhood of Fear, the Suburban Crisis in American Culture, 1975 to 2001. I think the periodization you're doing is so good and is so powerful. And the idea of the suburbs as a cultural space and a place of fear is something that I'll be thinking about for a while. You know what? We didn't get to Pac-Man. What does Pac-Man have to do with all of this? Because people aren't afraid of Pac-Man.
Pac-Man's on the social disease of the 80s, according to Time. Literally, like the headline. I mean, it is. So
there was a hysteria, in other words, about Pac-Man.
I mean, there was a hysteria about video games, and because Pac-Man was so popular, Pac-Man fever. You know, literally, there's a song. It's in newspapers, right?
Shit,
a top 10 song, I believe, or maybe top 20 song, Pac-Man Fever, on a whole album of video game theme songs, which Bruckner and Garcia, go look it up. But so Pac-Man became the representation of video game addiction. And then this is where it kind of coincides with drug culture, is like The idea that these mindless vidiots, as they were called, are pumping quarters into machines and not going to school, not doing their homework. And then when they go to the arcade, they're doing drugs, having sex, and drinking, right? And then ultimately fighting. And so the arcade is like a locus of all these things. And the games themselves as being sort of the dealer, right? Like they're drawing you into this space that is dangerous and creates this idea of the teen, helps create this idea of the teen as corruptible and corrupting, right? Sort of like the mall rat. It's like the mall and the arcade are sort of working together to create public spaces where teens are seen as dangerous and endangered. And Pac-Man becomes the kind of the doorway through. So you see all these towns move to regulate it, and malls themselves to regulate it, basically saying like these games are too addictive, right? Like they're too dangerous. They can't play them. Even though what they're really afraid of are the social effects, like the kind of secondary things to being in the arcade.
Wow. And I mean, I'm thinking about the progression from Pac-Man as a physical, location and arcade you go to a Game Boy that I played with, and like stuck staring at that Game Boy for hours and hours. Ultimately, the entire culture goes that way with phones, and you get people talking about addiction to phones and social media and things like that, but it's not quite couched in the same sort of like satanic panic or teenage thing.
Yeah.
Although, I think a lot of people are concerned about their kids' screen time and things like that. There is a through line there.
No, for sure. And there's definitely, even into the 90s, right? Kids going home and playing video games at home becomes its own set of problems, right?
Right.
Like playing Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or any of these games that like kind of, or Night Trap, right? That famous sort of game they wheel out in Congress as well. So there's a whole congressional hearing about video game violence and sexuality, right? And they wheel out a TV with a VCR and put in a tape, and they just play fatalities over and over. Like how no one plays the game, right?
Yes.
Like how no one would ever watch it in that era. And this is the symbol of like just the heartlessness of video games, how they're bringing this culture into the home and, as you say, desanctifying the home, right? It's always coming from this kind of like, implicitly religious place or Judeo-Christian place, right? As part of this broader story. You should go watch it. It's fascinating. It's like Joe Lieberman, as you might imagine, Herb Cole from Wisconsin,
the usual suspects,
but Democrats, right? Like these culture warriors who are, we all agree, right? In the 90s, this is a problem.
Tipper Gore, right? I mean,
yeah, there's a lot in there about PMRC and parenting culture for people who are interested, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. I have a great video, Rising to the Challenge, made by the PMRC, where they just like discuss in great detail all the horrible things of music and culture. But like they discuss it in such a way that like it feels like they like it. You know what I mean? Like they're like exposing to like,
oh my God, yes.
Here's the 15 or 50 albums you should buy if you want to be a cool kid. I mean, it was just like, this was the irony of stickering is every time an album got stickered, it sold more copies.
Oh yeah, for me, like when I was going to the buy music, whatever CD store I was at, I was looking for those parental advisory stickers, and I wanted that. I wanted that album because
of course
that had the good stuff on it.
It's like going behind the barn doors in the video store. Like,
that's right. Yeah, no,
not supposed to be in here. It's great.
There's irony upon irony and contradiction upon contradiction. I mean, I'm thinking about like the homeowner as as just a figure that everything is aimed toward, and how that's going to change or might not change in an era when home ownership is just not what the mass is doing at all.
That's interesting
stuff. Yeah. You've located, I think, something that an era that historians are going to have to be looking at a lot more, because it's just like it's almost like we're living in the sort of sequel to the era that you're describing.
No, I totally agree. And like my sincerest hope is that people will do more work in this based on, or jump off from, you pointed out like 5 or 6 things that aren't in the book that could be, skateboarding culture. I did actually some research on it, but like there's so many other venues of this that really need to be unearthed, and they need to be unearthed from those other perspectives too, right? The book is not sort of centrally concerned with, say, gender, even though I think there is quite clearly a story about sexuality and gender there, right? So, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, your book, it's like you've tapped into, a whole, a giant world, I think, of connections for me. And yeah, it is bigger. Cool. So thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was awesome.
All right, that is going to do it for us today. I want to thank my guest, Kyle Riismandel. Go check out his book. It's so good. For me, it was just like illuminating my childhood. It's called Neighborhood of Fear, The Suburban Crisis in American Culture, 1975 to 2001. I'm going to be thinking about fear as the organizing principle of the suburbs for a long time. So thank you, Kyle, for joining us. If you like our show, please think about supporting it. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We're a totally listener-supported operation. And if you join up, you get access to all of our bonus episodes, tons of stuff. Actually, at this point, like a lot of our stuff is on Patreon. So you're missing out on that if you're not a subscriber. And of course, our video lecture series on the Vietnam War, Nam TV, is part of that subscription as well. So patreon.com/nostalgiatrap is where you do that. Thanks so much, and we will be back very soon. Take care. See ya.